Hello, I am Luján Escalante. I'm a senior lecturer in co-design, and I work in the service design masters in London College of Communication. And I'm presenting this paper with Chris Mortimer. She's a senior international teaching fellow at Lancaster Management School and Lancaster University. And our paper is titled Value Mapping Transitions into the Pluriverse. And basically, we're sharing our design notes and our reflections on methods incorporating traditional ecological knowledge into emergency community resilient plans in 3 countries of the Rings on Fire: Indonesia, Malaysia, and the Philippines. We begin today by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the many lands across 3 continents where we were converging virtually today, paying our respects to their elders, past and present. Male, me, I'm from Venezuela, from the Andes. It's the land of the Motoquiques, but living and presenting from Bristol, the UK, at the historical center of piracy and slavery that impact the past and present of many lands, and specifically the Caribbean, where I grew up.
And I'm Chris, and I'm English, white British, and I'm presenting from York, the historical merchant centre, particularly famous for its chocolate production, using cacao and sugar exploited from many lands, particularly from the Caribbean, and this creates an ancestral link between us. Our work has entangled us with China and Southeast Asia, and this entanglements and the ethical implications are actually the focus of our presentation. In February 2019, we embarked on a research networking trip that took us from Bandung, Java to China, mostly over land. However, it became a transgressive ontoepistemological search that started our own transition into worlds where many worlds fit, a journey into the pluriverse. Most importantly, it sparked a radical questioning of our own practices, making us realise 3 years later that we're actually only at the beginning. Through our paper, we discuss the context of this journey and its aftermath, through our understanding of tech, the impact of value mapping, and the ethical entanglements that we encounter. The following intertwined threads underpin these elements, giving a context to this journey into the pluriversal design. Global Challenges research funding is the UK government's response to the UN Sustainable Development Goals, which encourage cross-disciplinary academic research to tackle global challenges in countries identified as least developed and lower income countries by the Development Assistance Committee, who describe themselves as the venue and voice of the world's major donors. We found that the very language of both these institutions precedes and defines roles as vertical rather than horizontal participation, even before the research encounters. We find ourselves at the very heart of this situation, attending events that incentivize world-leading researchers to carry out this work. Trending literature criticizes the agenda in terms of negative impact of British-led projects which power Western academic research profiles, but leave behind very little that fulfills the need to engage communities, the inclusion of local stakeholders, and ensuring community self-determination and participatory governance.
Our second thread of the context is our work in resilience theory, particularly in the context of emergency response and risk management. Resilience theory talks about, or is based on this balance, or is convergence of the organizations that manage resources and the organizations that manage knowledge. This balance will determine the adaptive capacity to disturbance of the communities, being this the emergencies. And examples of organizations that manage resources are, for example, the UN Disaster Risk Reduction, or the Red Cross, the Red Crescent, international organizations, but also national governmental organizations like public health. Organizations that manage knowledge are, for example, spaces where techno and scientific knowledge grow, for example, universities, or religion or cultural traditions like museums. And this creates cultural trust that is necessary for organizations to respond to emergency and communities to create cultural trust in these organizations.
From an Anglo-centric position, we are looking at the world through John Law's ideas, the one world world, assuming that the rest of humanity understand and trust our organizations that manage knowledge and resources. The pandemic highlights this distinction, where the pandemic discourse in the UK drew on World War II narratives to underpin trust, calmness, and hope in our institutions. However, these discourses are not globally applicable or acceptable, creating an ontoepistemological disconnect between Anglo-based researchers and the worlds in which we are encouraged through funding to participate in. All of this comes into sharp focus when attending 2 GCRF events in Malaysia, where we met academic and non-academic researchers and stakeholders from across disciplines, sectors and agencies working in disaster risk management. The recurring theme was how to bring together the necessary technological capability to anticipate, predict and model disasters, whilst understanding communication and mobilising local communities. Some of these issues include the myriad of languages spoken, in Indonesia over 800 languages, the multiplicity of religions and traditional cultures. In Malaysia alone, there are 6 main religious or belief systems and a variety of Malay indigenous belief clusters. Challenging access and transport infrastructure. The Philippines, for example, has 7,640 islands. Conflicting local and national building policies with local houses versus tourist development. There's also uneven levels of poverty, accentuating social inequalities and discrimination, particularly in gender and religion, and access to education. The outcome of these conversations was pointing to the need of DRM strategies and solutions that could work hand in hand with community-led initiatives.
So we saw that the convergence necessary in between the organizations that manage knowledge and the organizations that manage resources, not in all our contexts happens. Instead, there is a divergence. And so we identified our role as researchers with work in these transitions, how we go from this convergence to from this divergence to a convergence to increase community resilience. And we found home a theoretical framework of pluriversal design that was inspired in theories of the buen vivir by Alberto Acostas, of the 2 books of Arturo Escobar's on the pluriverse and the pluriverse design, and particularly John Law's work on the one world world that help us to articulate some binary differentiations that we were trying to escape from. For example, the West and the East, or the capitalist and or developed and underdeveloped. And in methodological sense, we found inspirations in the tools proposed by transition design.
In our paper, Through the Literature Review, we highlight the beneficial impacts of a horizontal relationship between tech and one world science. Tech is defined around 4 main characteristics, which include a focus on place, other ways of knowing, is participatory and communal, and is dynamic. Tech does not refer to static knowledge, nor the merely primitive attempts to account for natural phenomena. It is a process of constant revision and dynamic application of practical technical knowledge. The smoke story was an inspiration for us and highlighted the connection between modern times and events and stories and nursery rhymes from the past. Unraveling these threads, it becomes clear that efforts from management and knowledge institutions must be directed to learn from traditional-based existing institutions, systems of beliefs and technical ecological knowledge, not to gain more control agency and develop cultural trust, but to transform and adapt, informed by tech systems that have a millennial understanding of the social ecological balance between disturbance and adaptive capability.
So we got really inspired when we learned about the story of a lullaby saving hundreds of people in Ireland. And we start thinking in how can we design for transitions within the domain of emergency response and risk management. And our thought was to integrate participants' own traditional knowledges, given that in our workshops were a big diversity. So we run 3 workshops, one in Malaysia, one in Indonesia, and the other in the Philippines, and with participants that were researchers from different disciplines, from tourism to geography, and emergency, coming from work in emergency response agencies. And we did something that we call the value mapping, and it has a lot of reference. I invite you to read our paper, because it also describes exactly how we deploy it. But basically, we ask our participants to integrate the traditional ecological knowledge into the mapping of the emergency situation. Mapping of an emergency situation is something that they regularly do in their work when they are planning or when they are reflecting on an emergency response. However, with the integration of traditional ecological knowledge, we've had 3 insights. The most impactful was the change of representations. These emergency mappings usually happen in a timeline. So what happened in the first second, in the 3 minutes, in the first day, and so on. However, by introducing traditional ecological knowledge, the representations were in a space, and it was embedded in either land or objects. The other principles that help us to design these methods was the principle of controversy. That in this one we differ from some issues of co-design or design thinking, and we were careful to bring the controversies rather than to align to a consensus. And the third principle was the principle of sentir pensar, of feeling thinking, and it's about being aware of the different values in these systems where we were working.
We think through our conclusions, considering not only our positionality, but also our temporality, the changing moments in which the project takes place. We undertook this research whilst living and teaching in one of the places that has been called a new city or ghost town of China, and is composed of new high-rise apartments in which live relocated fishing and agricultural communities. The modernization dream of China meets the traditional. Encounters at Nanhai catalyzed a constant interrogation of Chinese and One World systems, not just at the theoretical level, but at a level that troubles the personal and what it means to know, to teach, to research, to design, and to manage. We find ourselves in a critical mode of transition, of becoming with a not yetness. There is an evolving literature concerned with the ethical problems of researching tech. These include pick and mix of those knowledges verified by One World science, unbalanced power relationships between researchers and communities, resulting often in erroneous interpretations of tech's holistic systems and organizations. We experienced how our perceived epistemic authority, the one gained from associations with a British university, did open spaces to be listened and heard, to set up collaborations. All opportunities we questioned whether our colleagues from the Ring of Fire would have if it were in their agendas and interests to develop work in the UK. This weight of perceived authority was something we do not want to carry. Is it even possible to reject one's own privileges? Do we have any rights to do this work? How can we deal with this? In understanding research and innovation as crucial instruments of sustaining One World's global systems of control via ideas of development, Tyfield suggests that to think beyond neoliberalism, we must first think with it and recognise each and every contribution of knowledge as technologies of power. In this sense, by acknowledging our positionality and temporality, we need to constantly think, what is our offer in this transaction? What skills, what knowledge, what technology of power can we use to scaffold civic participation? And can participatory design, inserted within transition design and designed for the Pluriverse framework, aid to transit the often murky relationship between us and them?
Thank you very much.
Thank you.